education, and places where racism is played out every day. We've all heard about instances where a Black person was seen as not belonging in a certain neighborhood, even if they live there. Black people have often been attacked, insulted, and arrested on public streets in this country. These assaults have increased over the past 4 years. Regardless of race, education, or economic status, people of African descent are seen as targets in public settings. Here's 15th Street in Oakland, where literally the art is on the street, a city where Black lives matter. Artists have always kind of been the voice of the revolution. This is Amber Newsom, a local artist and someone with whom I am collaborating right now. The history of art proves that creative agency and visual art have often been a driving force in revelation and revolution. Visual imagery has the power to convey messages in a manner that is unique. A viewer brings their ideas, memories, and experiences, which colors impressions and aids them in the discovery of meanings that are their own. Take a minute to think about the last time you saw artwork, a film, a photograph, or read a graphic novel. Think about how it made you feel. That is the power of art. This is Broadway in downtown Oakland. So the boards that are on buildings that are seen as unsightly are perfect for public art. Sometimes the work is what I want to call spontaneous. Other times it's commissioned. With colorful imagery and simple words, anybody passing by can understand and appreciate an artist's message. Solidarity Forever, the location is 8th and Clay Streets. This is what's called a flat iron building, and it presents a perfect surface for a mural which covers all 3 sides. Viewers on each of the streets have a different composition. Bright colors attract the eye. Amber Newsom says, it's nice to see people advocating for Black rights on walls. This is a mural celebrating both famous and everyday Black women. No doubt, the dreams that we have include being safe from police assaults, racist violence, economic inequality, medical and psychological care provided, and the right to cultural sovereignty. This is an Afro-futuristic portrait of praying hands. And yes, this is a bright depiction of the fact that indeed, Oaklanders do dream. Welcome to Africa Town. History, legacy, and of course, the image of Black Panthers. In the face of rampant gentrification and rising costs in the Bay Area and everywhere, this mural is a strong statement about the centrality of Black people in Oakland. Intersectionality is part of my presentation today. Because of their intersectional identity as both women and people of color, within discourses that are shaped to respond to one or the other, the interests and experiences of women of color are frequently marginalized by both. The intersection of racism and sexism factors into Black women's lives in ways that cannot be captured wholly by looking at the women, race, or gender dimensions of those experiences separately. Kimberly Crenshaw, the founder of the African American Policy Forum and the author of The Concept of Intersectionality. 15th Street and Broadway. Breonna Taylor's death at the hands of the police represents the intersection of racism and sexism. Until recently, there was silence about the issue of Black women being killed by police. Her death has brought women to the foreground of public discourse about police violence against Black people. This artist says, "I didn't have a master plan for this mural when I walked up to the wall. I took it as it came." To end the silence, the hashtag Say Her Name campaign was started in 2014 by the African American Policy Forum and Black women whose daughters had been killed by the police. Their names are listed here, some of the hundreds and thousands of names. Trafficked women and girls' lives matter to Regina Evans, an abolitionist in Oakland. Another area of silence and gender injustice has been the trafficking of girls and women. This is a $1 billion international industry. This street art intervention is located on International Boulevard, a major hub for the trafficking of girls and women, a significant number of whom are Black. We need to include trafficked youth as targets of systemic racism and economic exploitation. Beloved and Insistence, which is the name of this street intervention. It is a cascading flow of love, care, artistry, and creative inspiration. Regina Evans has been creating art on these streets for 10 years. She was recently joined and supported with a team of volunteers and abolitionist organizations. We exist to bequeath and present visual beauty to the beloved, who are currently being seared by the brutalizing grip of child sex trafficking. So you can see the brightness of the colors, the flowers, the objects, all of which are available for passersby and the women on the streets to take home. In doing so, we utilize city streets and sidewalks as our foundation to install garden altars, lighting design, street pole art, sidewalk art, and murals. 24 hours a day, colorful banners, lights, affirmative signs remind the viewers and the beloved about self-love and self-care. Within our installations, we embed resources, food, water, etc. You can see here, there are also flowers, there is water, and it's taken hours for people to come together on the streets and spontaneously put together these altars up and down for the beloved. During this time of COVID, we also embed PPE, such as masks, gloves, and hand sanitizers. COVID has had a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities across the nation. Lack of medical access and safe working conditions are other areas in which racism has negatively affected our communities. In closing, art is education, it's healing, it's revolution. Art changes the world. Thank you.
Good evening. Dr. Johnson's display and topic about art is a perfect intro into the topic that I'm going to bring to you this evening. Art is a form of resiliency. It's a form of coping, and the topic of resiliency as a constant, especially when you talk about the Black experience, you got to talk about where it comes from, where it started. Resiliency is being able to recognize your own emotions and behaviors when under stress and be able to manage them accordingly. It means embracing the fact that constant change is the norm and accepting the reality it brings. I have often thought about resiliency in the context of the Black experience in America. Enslaved Africans in the cargo of a ship on a transatlantic voyage that lasted 1 to 6 months, depending on the weather. They were facing a new reality. Those that survived the voyage were in the fog of constant change. Their strength, courage, and sure will was the foundation of a struggle that continues today. I've been reading Born into Slavery, Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project from 1936 to 1938. It contains 2,300 first-person accounts of slavery and 500 Black and white photographs of former slaves. They can be found in the Library of Congress. I've read about 400 narratives, and the constant theme that comes through is the resiliency of the individuals. Resiliency became learned behaviors to cope with daily atrocities that created deep emotional wounds, a legacy of wounds that have been passed down through generations of Black people in America. When we talk about resiliency as referring to the Black experience, you're looking at an ongoing system, and that was created to propagate this continued oppression. And when what you saw in Dr. Johnson's art is an expression of some of that oppression in ways that help people to cope. Resiliency is a hallmark of the Black experience in America. Through songs, prayers, and sure will, our ancestors passed down their stories of survival. My grandfather's grandfather was born in 1868. He was the first male in my paternal lineage born into freedom. I had the opportunity to spend several years with my grandfather, and so I was always curious about who we were, where we came from. I was always curious about their experience. And my grandfather was a farmer, and we grew up on a farm, and what we produced was our livelihood. I was always enamored by just his strength, his ability to just push through. And, thank God I had the opportunity to observe that, because a lot of that, skill set I learned and I've carried throughout my life. Like I say, I grew up on a farm, and we had to deal with floods, tornadoes, cold weather, and racism. I grew up in central Mississippi. I was born in 1965, so I was I was a child of the civil rights movement. And it shaped who I was, because the adults in my family were directly experiencing that. And so I was being brought up in an environment that when you talked about Martin Luther King's march, when you talked about John Lewis, when you talk about the civil rights movement as a whole in our household, you're hearing that resilience. I spent 30 years in the Army and went to war twice during my career. Those skills of resiliency got me through 30 years, and it got me through those 2 tours of war. Resiliency is is my driving engine. And I am because of the strength and courage to a lineage that started in the cargo of a ship. As I've gone through and read many of these narratives, like I said, the theme that kept coming through for me was the resiliency that throughout years and years and years of oppression that these former slaves talked about, displayed. It's a very deepening of the soul to hear first-person accounts of slavery and what the people went through. I feel very proud to be a Black American because of the sacrifices that these people went through. I feel that there's still more work to be done. I feel that what we're experiencing day to day is a continued legacy of that work. When you hear Black Lives Matter, when you see the protests out on the street, when you see the people raise up and say, scream for change, that's the legacy of those people in that cargo. I want to end with a stanza from Maya Angelou's poem, the last stanza from Maya Angelou's poem, Still I Rise. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wonderfully clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Thank you.
So good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you so much to Dr. Lopez-Littleton and to others who organized today's forum. This is an excellent opportunity for us to think together about the scope of anti-Black racism and the ways that it impacts our lives. One of the things that I wanted to put our attention on was what are the ways that the hierarchies of racism are embedded in our language practices and in the policies that we may not even be aware, practices and policies that we may not even be aware that we're enacting. And when I talk about language practices, I'd like for us to pause for a moment and think about the ways that even the notion of race is in fact a construct of racism. So, for example, humans belong to one race, right? There are different ethnicities, but there is no such thing as race. So you think of the first act of racism as the development of the construct of race. And one way to reverse that construct is to stop using it, to when we're referring to differences amongst people, to actually refer to ethnicity as opposed to race. Now that said, racism is quite real. Race is not. And what that means is that because of racism, we've been taught to see darker skin and other Black features as symbolic of danger, inferiority, unpleasantness, unattractiveness, and people lacking in skills and intellect. We know that none of these things are true, but because they are so ubiquitously taught and have been historically so ubiquitously taught, it's very difficult for us to avoid having unconscious bias towards Blackness, towards Black people, as they present in every ethnicity, not just Black people of African descent. And this is some of what Dr. Eberhardt alludes to in her recent study that she talked with us about a couple of days ago as a CSUMB campus when she did a Zoom presentation for us. She talked about her research that showed how from as early as preschool, folks start to look at Black children as troublemakers, as dangerous, and that it's a very unconscious process, that people aren't even aware that they're doing it. And that this translates into the professional realms, it translates into law enforcement. So what we learn from these types of studies, and particularly from her book, Biased, which I really recommend reading, is that even when we are not aware of it, even when we have in our minds a conscious intention not to enact anti-Black racism, we are often still behaving in ways that reflect anti-Black racism. And I'm focusing on anti-Black racism because all racism is not the same. There are different types of racism directed towards different types of people. So it's kind of important that we be able to distinguish, okay, well, what does my anti-Asian racism look like? What kinds of messages have I learned about Asian people that I need to unlearn? What does my anti-Latinx racism look like? What does my anti-Indigenous racism look like? And what does my anti-Black racism look like? I think it's very useful for us to make those distinctions. And a language practice that I use is not using the term race, not using the term race when I can use the term ethnicity, and also not using the term people of color, rather using the term people of the global majority, because Latinx, Asian, Indigenous, and African heritage people are the majority of the world's population. And using that phrase instead of people of color reminds us that people of the global majority are not minorities, that non-white people are the majority of the global population. And it also takes us out of the trap of using the language of colonizers and enslavers who labeled people by color. Whereas, you know, the closer you were to white, the more proximity you had to white, the higher you were on the racist hierarchy. So unlearning some of that language and paying attention to the distinctions between the different types of bias, racism-informed bias we have, can really be helpful towards our self-knowledge. And also being able to think about the quality and nature of anti-Black bias as it impacts our relationships can help expand our possibilities in those relationships. So I'm going to say a little bit about a concept called misogynoir. It's mentioned here at the bottom of the slide. And it's a term, misogynoir is a term that was coined by a scholar by the name of Moya Bailey, because she recognized that there was a very distinct experience of sexism that Black women and girls are targeted with. And it starts very young with the adultification of Black girls, where Black girls are seen as older than they are sexualized at very early age, are seen as aggressive at very early ages. And then she traces the impact of misogynoir on the degradation, mistreatment, and exploitation of Black women throughout the life cycle. So because I have a short time with you today, I'm sharing concepts and resources with you so that perhaps you'll have an opportunity to look further into them. There have been a few articles written about misogynoir and the unique ways it shows up. And there's also an excellent, the adultification of Black girls is a study that's out of Georgetown Law School that really studied this phenomena. So if you look up the adultification of Black girls study, you'll be able to find it. And there's also a really short video on it that talks about it. But misogynoir also shows up in other ways. Doctors perceiving Black women as having a higher pain threshold, Black women being viewed as threatening or angry whenever they speak up for themselves, Black female students having lower success rates because they are viewed a particular way in the educational process, Black female faculty having unique challenges related to misogynoir, maternal mortality, which Dr. Johnson, I think, mentioned. And also because Black women are viewed as overly sexual, they are more often targeted with sexual assault. One of the highest risks of sexual assault is for Black women. Also, the expectation that Black women will fill nurturing roles. All of these are aspects of misogynoir. So it's really, I think, a useful concept for us to think about in terms of our relationality with Black women. And the other piece that I'll share about with you in terms of misogynoir is the impact of sexual exploitation as it has kind of shaped our genetic pool. There's a recent study that's been done that looked at the transatlantic slave trade, which my colleague just alluded to, and the instance of rape and the high prevalence of rape of Black women throughout the Americas. So regardless of whether, you know, enslaved Africans were sent to, you know, Panama or to the Caribbean or to, you know, other parts of the Americas, the incidence of rape was consistent, so that the gene pool throughout the Americas is largely shaped by this factor. So I really recommend taking a look at that study. It's entitled The Genetic Consequences of the Transatlantic Slave Trade in America. And the last thing I'll say, because I think I'm running out of time, is that it's very useful for us to take a look at how our disciplines have been impacted by anti-Black racism. So as colleagues, whatever you're studying, whatever you're teaching, if we haven't thought about, okay, who are the African heritage people who have contributed to this discipline, then that means we don't know as much as we could about that discipline. Whatever it is we specialize in and are interested in, if we're not aware of the contributions of Black people to that, then our knowledge of our very discipline is compromised by anti-Black racism, right? And it's useful for us to take a look at our discipline and also consider the ways that our discipline may have been used to legitimize anti-Black racism, right? We know that there's racism in science. We know that educational policies have been manipulated to reflect racist ideas. So from two different lenses, we can benefit and enrich our own understanding of our professional realm by considering how anti-Black racism compromises what we know about Black contributions and how our discipline enacts anti-Black racism. So there's a million more things I'd love to say, and I look forward to us having continued dialogue about these really important topics. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Before I launch into my presentation, I wanted to just do a quick reflection on the fact that we didn't establish a Q&A for this session. And I see that some of you guys are raising your hands. When we put this forum together, we wanted to center on Black voices. We wanted to give our Black faculty and our Black staff an opportunity to speak their truths and to use the time and to use the space to exist and to talk about things that were relevant to them. So our goal is that if you want to engage us in further conversation, at the end, we have one slide where you can do a quick screenshot of that so that you can get in contact with us and further this discussion. Our hope is that this is not the last time that we'll have these types of conversations. We want to be able to engage you, but we also want to be able to take the time to be able to speak our truths. And so we hope that you can respect and appreciate the way that we've structured this. We're moving through our agenda relatively quickly. And so I'm not sure if my colleagues will be open to answering a few questions, but I'll leave it to the facilitators and I'll get to my business. So I'm going to be talking about dismantling systemic racism and spending time thinking about institutional and individuals' responsibilities in that. And so I'm excited to be here today and to talk about systemic racism. I realize this is a very controversial topic, but from my purview, this is something that's necessary and it's an extremely important conversation to have. But my goal is not to placate you or to convince you of anything. Instead, I'm here to provide you with a perspective that may be different from your own. But let me start by saying and being very clear about what systemic racism is not. Systemic racism is not a bunch of racists working to harm Black people with ill intent. Systemic racism is not an individual or single policy intended to somehow harm or target Black folks. Instead, systemic racism is a set of interconnected policies that combine to create differential outcomes. The reason we call it systemic is because these policies are embedded in many different systems, organizations, and institutions. This includes public, private, government, and nonprofit organizations. So when you get down to it, we all have a role to play in dismantling systems that create different outcomes for different people. But let's be clear about why we benchmark racial and ethnic groups against white populations. First, the white population in the United States is the current majority population. Second, the white population has the most access to social, economic, and political power in the United States. But this conversation is not about privilege or something negative towards white people. This is about the structure of the society that we live in and how we operationalize a response to that system that has for decades failed a particular group of people. And in this case, we're talking specifically about Black people. I want to offer you a profound example about systemic racism from my area of study. In the United States, Black infants are more than twice as likely to die before the age of 1 than white babies. These babies die from birth defects, preterm and low birth weights, maternal complications, SIDS, and other injuries. What we know about infant deaths are that many of the different risk factors combine to create these risks for Black babies. Yet no known combination of risk factors fully accounts for the differences between Black and white infants. These disparities occur without regard to income, education, occupation, or even the insurance status of the mother. So that a Black college-educated mother is more than twice as likely to lose her baby before the age of 1 than a white woman with less than a high school education. Here's an even harder pill to swallow. In this day and age, Black women are more than 3 times more likely to die from maternal complications than white women. So race seems to be a risk factor for adverse health outcomes. Yet there is no genetic marker for race. Race is a social construct. This means that the vast majority of these deaths occurring to Black infants and Black women are avoidable, unnecessary, and unjust. How many Black bodies have to pile up before someone will be brave enough to challenge the healthcare system's lack of responsiveness to Black people? We've been conducting research and spending billions of dollars to close the gap, to eliminate the gap for more than 6 decades. Yet these gaps still exist. And in some cases, the gaps are widening. But we are too afraid to demand a healthcare system that holds people, individuals, and even the system itself accountable. We know that there are healthcare systems where the majority of the deaths occur. And the most interesting thing is, white women don't deliver their babies there. So there are different levels of treatment and access to care for different groups. There are also different experiences with healthcare providers. For decades, Black women have complained that their healthcare providers won't listen to them, or that they yell at them, or that they make assumptions about them that are not true. Providers get to pick and choose who they deliver care to based on the type of insurance that folks have. There are racist and biased providers that deliver inferior care to Black patients. We know this. The research is there, the evidence is clear. But we can't solely focus on these so-called bad actors, as there are numerous other factors that also contribute to the poor health outcomes. If we're going to begin to improve health outcomes for Black infants and Black mothers, we're going to have to dismantle not only the healthcare system, but many other systems that make their own contributions to these differential outcomes. This includes segregated education systems that create pipelines into the criminal justice system for countless Black youth. This includes the criminal justice system that's riddled with so-called bad actors. So you see, in order to dismantle systems, you can't just look at the killing of George Floyd. You can't just look at the other countless men and women who've lost their lives with interactions with law enforcement. Once you have the data, you can start to look upstream to understand the system that allows these deaths to occur. These deaths have been proceeding unabated for decades, and there's nothing being done in a systemic way to stop the killing. If there were justice in the criminal justice system, the killing of Black men in the United States of America at the hands of law enforcement would be akin to state-sanctioned violence. Law enforcement officers are street-level bureaucrats dispensing justice based on officer discretion. This is the same type of discretion we see in healthcare. The result is no one is accountable and the body count is mounting. If there was 1, 2, or 3 categories where these disparities would occur or exist, we could blame the so-called bad actors. But the fact that Black men, women, children are at a greater risk of dying from injury, death, disease, and now even COVID-19 across all income, education, occupation, insurance status level, this is evidence of a broader system at play. Some official denying that the existence of systemic racism is not real, well, that's evidence of a clear perpetuation of a continuation of the cycle of violence against Black bodies. As a Black woman, I can't educate myself out of this high-risk category. I can't move to a better zip code to reduce my relative risk. What I'm saying is, I can run, but I cannot hide. While I may be able to remove myself from inner city crime, I still run the risk of a heart attack or stroke from continually functioning in high intensity, low stakes situations, constantly swimming upstream to find a place in academia, being more than qualified for incremental promotions that bring additional stress and burden, but relatively little cash. So while my risk for being shot on the block may have decreased, my risk of death remains higher than my white counterparts due to the constant stress of surviving in a sea of systemic racism. Racism my white counterparts can flat out deny or reject. In fact, some have been so bold to challenge me by saying, if you look for race-based outcomes, you will certainly find them. So for them, they don't have to think about racialized outcomes. So they assume that they don't exist, but I don't have that luxury. I don't go looking for help for these disparities. They come looking for me. You see, as a Black woman, I'm at a greater risk of dying from cardiovascular disease than any other group in America. My work, my livelihood is contributing to my demise. The stress of being the only one who looks like me in leadership positions, in management positions, the stress I have for the fear of my 2 Black sons being shot down on the street, the stress that I have when I go see a healthcare provider, and if I don't tell them that I too am a registered nurse, who knows what would happen to me? The stress that while my colleagues are buying homes, I'm saddled with more than $200,000 in student loan debt. The stress that when I speak my truth as a Black woman, some white person will say to me, well, I also have student loan debt. I also don't own a home. I'm also worried about my kid. Well, all of these are further evidence of systemic racism. By and large, white folks don't have these stressors. Historically, they've been able to contribute in a real way to the founding values and principles of this country. They've been able to navigate, lead, and manage systems and institutions for decades without having to show up and prove that they are exceptional enough to be there. This is who we are, yet it does not have to be this way. So I know I've said a lot. So in closing, I want to leave you with these takeaways. In the words of Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. The journey that began back in 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation was only the beginning. The mass incarceration of Black men, women, and yes, even Black children, the seemingly entrenched disparities in health outcomes, and the bloody catalog of oppression that includes the names of Black men and women murdered by so-called Black actors represent a continuation of the insult that began when Africans first arrived in this country as chattel slaves. While we are no longer in shackles and chains, we remain entrenched by societal norms that tether us to intergenerational trauma. Second, we all have a role to play in dismantling systemic racism. We have power to create change, but we have to be willing to take part in the revolution. This country has a racist history, one in which we've never fully reckoned with. Dismantling systemic racism will require the reshaping of the dominant paradigm. We all have a role and a responsibility to play in advancing our collective values. No one group should be intentionally excluded in the way our founding fathers relegated Black bodies by declaring them as property. And lastly, it is far past time for the US to renegotiate the social contract and to include the voices and values of all citizens. We can no longer wait for the system to miraculously change. We have to be active, and we have to be the change, and we have to generate those levels of accountability that we want to see in the system. We can't look for others to do this work. We have to do it. So from wherever you sit, you must demand that policymakers advance racial and social equity by implementing accountable systems. You must demand that Black voices be heard and respected. You must reject the politicization of Black Lives Matter by demanding that any system that is unable to stop Black people from dying at a disproportionate rate than other folks, that system needs to be redesigned into a more equitable service delivery model. We must demand that, and we must hold our governments accountable for those actions. It is time to renegotiate the social contract. We all have a role to play in moving this country forwards and not backwards. And because we know that freedom is a constant struggle, we must commit ourselves to doing the work. I thank you for your time and attention and for listening to my passion.
Para suayo, omonya langwana guma magemina. O para suayo, ege bamba wa eshodana. Omonya langwana guma magemina. Greetings. That is a Yoruba chant that is sung by African descendants both in Cuba and Brazil. In its own way, it echoes the mural that Dr. Stephanie Johnson showed us earlier. A gloss on its meaning would be something like, Almighty, please do not cut off our lifeline. Lend us some of your power so that we can accomplish our work on the earth until it is time for us to meet you again. The roots of Black music in the Americas lie in West and Central Africa. Our ancestors who were transported to the Americas as slave laborers brought with them profound musical traditions with a heavy emphasis on polyrhythm and the drum, in combination with dance and call and response singing. Between the 16th and the late 19th centuries, more than 1 million Africans came to the New World, predominantly from the region stretching from the Senegal River through the vicinity of present-day nations such as Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, and down through modern-day Angola, the majority of them arriving in the Caribbean and Latin America. In all of their homelands, music was organized and performed as an important part of everyday life. Drums have come to symbolize African descendant spiritual practices in the Caribbean and Latin America. Drummers play a key role by supporting ceremonial events with music, synchronizing their art with singers and dancers to make these spiritual events happen. Whenever a state has attempted to eradicate African religion in the Americas, they have begun by forbidding the use of the drum. The drum was attacked as a dangerous representation of Black identity and agency. The religious communities in question are largely African in character, and participants often sing in African languages. Harassed by Iberian American authorities, Afro-Latin people maintained evolving musical traditions that combined drum, dance, and song in ways that fomented well-being in the community. The maintenance of these traditions against all odds is a testament to the resilience of African peoples in the New World. This image that you all see right now is of Afro-Cuban bata drummers. It's one great example of among many throughout the Americas of African people maintaining their traditions in the face, in contestation to systemic racism. The bata drum tradition exemplifies the kind of precarious history shared by many African diaspora music styles from the colonial era up until now. Colonial laws and European racism pushed to eradicate their tradition by prescribing the times and context in which Blacks could gather and by outlawing the fabrication of drums themselves. Simultaneously, the influx of large numbers of enslaved Africans, in this case, Yoruba ethnic group, in the early decades of the 19th century, and their organization by colonial authorities into cabildos, the name for Catholic church-affiliated mutual aid societies based on African ethnic origin, inadvertently helped keep the practices alive. Within the cabildos, Blacks had some freedom to practice their old traditions and adapt them to their new circumstances. This situation contrasts with British North America, what will become these United States of America, where Protestant evangelism did a lot more to erode and eradicate African musical practices. Check out this book, you all, that's called Sinful Tunes and Spirituals by Dana Epstein. She documents throughout the 1600s and 1700s instances where African music makers renounced their practice in the face of kind of strong arming by evangelical proselytizers. The photograph you see here is from a bata drum ceremony or toque in Holguin, Cuba. The drummers are dressed uniformly in white as a symbol of purity and unity. They wear special hats that mark the fact that they are in ceremony and that protect their heads from the spiritual power activated by the drumming. The young man whose eyes hold us exudes calm authority and serene intensity. The drums themselves are wrapped with aprons of fabric called bante, encrusted with beads and mirrors. This adornment is a sign of honor, signaling that these drums have been specially crafted, ritually prepared, and devoted to the spirit of sound called anya for use in sacred ceremonies. The posture of the three men shows fluidity, composure, and power. They stand together and move as one in the performance. The building of these kind of African-based religious practices that center music, again, was a direct contestation to systemic racism dating from the colonial era up into the present day. My current research as an anthropologist, as an ethnomusicologist, examines how practitioners of related religious systems, not in Cuba now, rather in Brazil, a tradition called candomblé, also from the Yoruba people, have transformed, limited, or eliminated the use of drums for ceremonies as a means of protecting themselves from religious intolerance in the form of legal trouble or actual violence. In the absence of drumming or collective ceremony at all, the whole religious system is affected and really in peril. The type of research that we're endeavoring right now about performance is key because Yoruba and related diasporic faiths like Santeria in Cuba or Candomblé in Brazil are, quote, danced religion, end quote, in which much of the liturgy lives and the philosophy is expressed and understood through dancing and drumming. Therefore, to strike at the dance and drum practices is to attack these religious communities at their very roots. The research that we're doing right now, and which has been quite challenged by the Corona era and restrictions on travel, is based on participant observation and interviews with community members in the state of Bahia, Brazil, particularly the regions in and around the capital city of Salvador. We're interviewing community members, including priests, performers, and drummers, to provide important details for analysis about religious intolerance against African religious practices. The repression of Brazilian candomblé has a long history dating back to the colonial era, but we're focusing now on current expressions of intolerance. This is a parallel in Brazil to the current wave within the United States of anti-Black sentiment, anti-Black violence, which is being aided and abetted by the state, where we see, police, et cetera, kind of look the other way as African Americans are threatened or actually, touched by violence. I want to give a shout out to one of my research collaborators, Dr. Danielle Boaz at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She created a database, and the image that we're looking at now is from that. The flames that you see don't represent individual events, but if we were to come in further, represent actually hundreds of instances of religious intolerance against candomblé and other related African religions in Brazil. Among the cases, we see instances of social media bullying against young people who are affiliated with African religions. We see stonings of people who are caught on the way to an African ceremony. We see religious leaders being kidnapped and threatened threatened with death if they continue to lead their communities in the African ways of their ancestors. We see religious monuments being destroyed. We see temples being burned down. And this is very concerning, of course. The collaborators that I'm working with, we envision our research project as a way to intervene against this intolerance. For example, the country Brazil has accepted and kind of enjoyed the naming of these African practices as Patrimony of Humanity by UNESCO and kind of world organizations, but at the same time, they're doing nothing to protect the Black practitioners of these centuries-old faiths. Black lives matter, Black spirituality matters, right? And so the research that I'm engaged in now is documenting the challenges to these religious faiths and trying to find a way to make it stop. I'm going to close with one more chant. This one echoes some of the sentiments of earlier presenters tonight in terms of resiliency, in terms of the presenters here and African American communities throughout our nation now being the descendants of people who found a way to hold on throughout difficult situations. A gloss on the chant that I'm going to share now is something like, "Hear me, dear ones, listen, friends of the heart, the ones who were taken away we're born of God too. We are blessed and we are still here. Ago abureo kanani, ago niloniye. Ago abureo kanani, ago niloniye. Ago elegua niloniye bioloru. Ago niloniye bioloru. Ago niloniye bioloru. Ago niloniye orororo. Niloniye bioloru. Niloniye bioloru. Niloniye bioloru. I go. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Vaughn, and to all the speakers. So I grew up in the same streets of Oakland that Dr. Johnson shared with you all. Mr. McClellan's discussion of being forced to be resilient with racism, being another external force. Dr. Majid's discussion of embedded racism and race as a construct and urging us to consider the language we use. Don't use the phrase people of color. There's many reasons why you shouldn't use it. It also throws all of the folks that are, involved in color, right, into one basket. But there's many different reasons as to why that's a problem. There's nuanced kind of issues that kind of get erased when you throw us all into people of color, right? In addition to what Dr. Majid kind of illustrated, as well as, her discussion of misogynoir and all the issues that are involved with that. Dr. Lopez-Littleton's description of the micro instances of systemic racism that have kind of infiltrated everything that we kind of do in our daily lives. And then Dr. Vaughn connecting ancestral use of percussion, music, and art to our legacies, demonstrating the interconnectedness of culture, tradition, and history, and systemic racism. All of this to say, this event was not a showcase, but rather a window into the daily lives and issues we face every day. My greatest hope is that you don't think of today as a period, but rather a semicolon, an avenue to continued support and work towards the fight for racial equality and justice. It is my hope that you won't close this webinar window and go about business as usual, but rather take some time to reflect on your own practices or actions that may contribute to racial inequality or racial injustice. Acclaimed author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates writes to his son in his book, Between the World and Me, "You must resist the common urge towards confronting narrative of divine law, toward fairy tales that imply some irrepressible justice. The enslaved were not bricks in your road, and their lives were not chapters in your redemptive history. They were people turned to fuel for the American machine. Enslavement was not destined to end, and it is wrong to claim our present circumstance, no matter how improved, as the redemption for the lives of people who never asked to be posthumous, untouchable glory of dying for their children. Our triumphs can never compensate for this." End of quote. I mentioned Coates to highlight the fact that we are not far from the grave tragedy of unjust death or the taking of Black bodies. In fact, due to technology, we are closer than ever to death every day. But I don't want to harp on death. I'd much rather celebrate the fact that I am alive despite death being all around me. In fact, author, brilliant mind, and hero of mine, June Jordan says, "Life is not given, that to live means you owe something big to those whose lives were taken away." And my question to you all is, what will you do to honor those whose lives have been taken away unjustly, or those that have been unfairly treated? What does that mean for CSUMB and the community? It means that 27 years ago, CSUMB founders, such as our very own Dr. Stephanie Ann Johnson, came together to write the vision that they wanted for the soil on which every building now sits on. They harvested language such as social responsibility, community building, multicultural, gender equitable, and diversity. All of our presenters today represent that vision coming to fruition. Each of them have spoken to the call for racial justice through a range of different disciplines and lenses. Now it is up to you all to continue the work towards racial justice in your own lives, communities, and classrooms. For professors, this means interrogating your pedagogical practices and making sure that they are not alienating students because of their race. It means fostering equitable assessments and studies. For staff, this means making sure the practices in place are in alignment with what our founders envisioned for this campus. For students, this means advocating for your peers, engaging in activities that work to quell injustice for the community. This means having those tough conversations with family members and loved ones. For all of us, this means promising that we will dedicate our time and energy towards making the world a place where everyone can live and thrive without the threat of violence or injustice.
Wow, that was such an amazing experience for me as a student and for my fellow colleagues and for all the students who have shown up today. It's amazing for us to be able to hear from your perspectives. So I want to thank you on behalf of myself as a student. And I also want to thank some of our allies and supporters who have put together this event for us, such as the Office of Inclusive Excellence, the Otter Cross Cultural Center, the California Faculty Association, the Committee of Racism and Social Justice, the Center for Black Student Success, Teaching, Learning, and Assessment, and the African Heritage Faculty and Staff Alliance, as well as all the professors who have brought their classes for today. And this concludes our teach-in, and we want to thank you all for coming to this amazing event.
So if you all want to continue conversation, or if you do have questions, again, we're not going to have a Q&A, but that slide, that very last slide that's up there has our contact information, and you can get in contact with folks using those emails.
Yeah, I just wanted to leave it up there just a little while longer to make sure that we could give folks an opportunity to take a screenshot of it or get it. Our contact information, I think it may be on the flyer as well, and we're all accessible through the CSUMB email. Dr. Stephanie Ann Johnson is on sabbatical this semester, so she can only be reached via the Gmail account. But we are available to engage you in dialogue and conversation that extends far past this event. It is our hope that we will have additional opportunities in the future. And my apologies for leaving the Otter Cross Culture Center off of the sponsor list. They were active partners in this and helping to bring this event to fruition. So thank you. This concludes our session.